Mysterious battles that changed history in silence to fall asleep to while pale lights stretched across the jagged ridges of the Andes, casting long, trembling shadows over the desert-edged town of Cajamarca. The air was thin and cold, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath, and in that stillness, the world seemed suspended between heartbeats. Dawn was approaching, a soft gray seep of light spilling over terraced hills and stone plazas, yet the quiet was more than natural. It was expectant, tense, as if the earth itself knew that a singular moment was poised to fracture time. Somewhere in the distance, the murmur of the river trickled over rocks, its rhythm almost drowned by the soft footfalls of men moving in secret. In these hours before the sun fully awoke, the empire of the Incas still dreamed in its golden stone, unknowing of the storm that approached. Atahualpa, emperor of the Inca realm, rose from his chamber with the dignity of a sovereign who had never known fear. His robes shimmered like molten sunlight, his hands resting on the promise of dominion, his eyes reflecting the jagged peaks that had cradled his ancestors for centuries. The great plaza stretched before him, filled with nobles, soldiers, and attendants who had, until this day, believed the empire impervious, untouchable, as eternal as the mountains themselves. Yet beneath this calm veneer, the pulse of tension hovered. Foreign men had entered the valleys months before, their intentions veiled, their movements unpredictable and still. The emperor held onto the fragile illusion that diplomacy, ceremony, and gold could bend their will. It was a morning of ceremony and certainty, the kind that masks terror, the kind that lulls a civilization into forgetting that the world beyond stone walls can move with deadly precision. Pizarro's men arrived not with the thunder of thousands, but with a careful choreography of silence and shadow. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, equipped with steel, gunpowder, and the cold calculation that only men who walk the edge of conscience can muster, positioned themselves among the narrow streets and sun-bleached buildings. They were ghosts, their intent folded, like daggers in the dawn mist. Atahualpa approached with confidence, surrounded by the rich tapestry of Inca pageantry, unaware that the very squares that had celebrated victories now waited, silent and patient, to witness a fall unlike any before. A single volley, the flash and smoke of muskets, tore through the morning calm. Horses, previously unheard of to the empire's inhabitants, thundered through the plaza, their hoofs beating a rhythm that echoed like a death knell across stone. Screams rose, then fractured into silence, swallowed by disbelief. No one understood how so few could strike so decisively, how so few could unravel an empire that had commanded tens of thousands. The plaza became a theater of shadows, men and nobles thrown into chaos, and in that instant, the intangible shocked awe. Terror was more lethal than any blade. The capture of Atahualpa was swift, almost unreal. He fell not to armies, but to stratagem, to the manipulation of fear and the exploitation of trust. His chains clinked softly, a sound both intimate and eternal, vibrating across the Andes like a low lament that no one could silence. The Incas, powerful and proud, had no precedent for such a precise, merciless act, and in that incomprehensible moment, centuries of empire seemed to unravel at the edges. Gold, symbols of divine authority, shimmered uselessly in the faces of those who had been told they were untouchable. Silence, broken only by distant cries, became the language of calamity, a language more resonant than swords or drums. It was a collapse delivered not in the fury of open battle, but in the almost spiritual pause between expectation and realization, a pause where entire civilizations can die without warning. As the sun climbed higher, spilling light over broken banners and stunned courtiers, Pizarro's shadow seemed to stretch further than the limits of the plaza. The Andean peaks bore witness, unchanging and eternal, to a moment when destiny and human cunning entwined in ways that no chronicler could fully capture. The fall of Atahualpa did not roar, it whispered. The empire did not shatter with cannons or catapults, but with the delicate, invisible hands of strategy, fear, and misjudged trust. Even now, centuries later, the echoes linger, the chains, the gold, the disbelief intertwined with the mountain's unyielding presence. The question that rises from the dust of Cajamarca is one that cannot be answered. Was it fate, genius, or the fragile hubris of a civilization blind to the approaching footstep of history that brought ruin? And in the quiet aftermath, when the Spaniards marched into the valleys and the Incas stared at a world suddenly stranger and more precarious than they had imagined, the Andes exhaled their ancient breath. Empires do not always fall with cannon fire or clashing steel. Sometimes they crumble in a heartbeat of suspended disbelief, in a stunned hush when power realizes it is mortal, and in the silent gaze of mountains that have witnessed the rise and fall of countless dreams. The plaza of Cajamarca remained, empty yet echoing, a sacred witness to a moment that carried both the weight of gold and the inevitability of mortality. In that stillness, one understands the cruel poetry of history. The vast can fall in silence, and a single shadow can unravel what seemed eternal. The story of that dawn persists, a whisper through time, asking all who would listen whether empires ever truly die, or if they merely slumber, waiting for the day that the world's hand will stir them from their fragile dreams. The air over the Bengal plains was thick with heat and humidity, a slow, clinging veil that made every breath feel heavy, as if the world itself were pressing down on the shoulders of those who moved beneath it. June 1757 had arrived quietly, the sun rising over sugarcane fields and river banks with the casual indifference of eternity, yet the currents of fate were stirring beneath its calm surface. In the small, bustling town of Plassey, the earth seemed to hum with anticipation, a vibration that only the most sensitive hearts could feel, a subtle prelude to the collapse of kingdoms. Soldiers' boots pressed into the dry soil, leaving footprints destined to vanish under the weight of history. And somewhere in the distant chambers of palaces and mansions, secrets were being whispered, like shadows bending toward the inevitable. The Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla, proud and young, moved through the streets of his city with the confident air of a ruler who had inherited authority as naturally as he had inherited blood. Draped in silks, the intricate patterns catching the early sun, he was surrounded by attendants, guards, and advisors, all moving in rehearsed synchrony. Unaware that the very people he trusted would become instruments of his downfall, he believed in the power of numbers and loyalty bought by gold and respect in the certainty of tradition and divine favor. His army was vast, his fortresses formidable, yet he underestimated the silent currents flowing beneath his world, currents woven from ambition, treachery, and human weakness far beyond the Nawab's guarded walls. A smaller force moved with deliberate quietness. Robert Clive, leading a handful of men from the British East India Company, understood a different kind of warfare, one that thrived not on overwhelming strength, but on subtlety, manipulation, and the intimate knowledge of human nature. Every gesture, every word, every exchanged glance became a calculated instrument, a piece of a puzzle meant to tip the balance. Without a single clash of swords, he met with Mir Jafar in secret, a man whose loyalty was pliable, molded by desire and fear. Promises of wealth, power, and position were whispered in candlelit rooms, sealing a betrayal that would make the sun itself seem complicit. In its quiet complicity, the day of confrontation arrived under an oppressive sky. Cannons were ready, muskets poised, and the troops assembled with the kind of discipline that masks nerves and fear. Siraj's army, confident in its superiority, waited on the banks of the river, while the British forces took positions that were deliberately understated, almost invisible, blending into the terrain like ghosts. The first shots rang out, not in a thunderous salvo, but with the unsettling precision of inevitability. As the noise of battle crescendoed, the Nawab's forces faltered inexplicably. Entire regiments hesitated, weapons lowered, their hearts subdued by unseen hands. The betrayal of Mir Jafar unfolded silently, almost invisibly. Reinforcements withheld, orders reversed, soldiers slipping into inaction. Confusion spread like wildfire across the ranks. Yet it was a fire that left no smoke, a destruction executed with near invisible elegance. Siraj, witnessing the collapse of his army, could scarcely comprehend the sudden disintegration of the world he had thought secure. His eyes, sharp and proud only hours before, now reflected disbelief, sorrow, and the profound loneliness of betrayal. The city he ruled, the riches he safeguarded, the pride he carried all seemed to dissolve into the humid air, leaving behind only the stark, silent geometry of ruin. By the afternoon, Clive stood victorious, his forces having suffered negligible loss. His triumph achieved not through overwhelming force, but through the intimate orchestration of human frailty. The Nawab was captured, the riches of Bengal transferred almost without resistance, and an entire subcontinent's future bent quietly under the weight of an unseen hand. As evening settled, the sun lowered itself behind distant palms, casting elongated shadows over fields now strewn with the remnants of illusion and misplaced trust. The air once heavy with anticipation, was now thick with the residue of human ambition and quiet devastation. Bengal had changed forever. Yet the transformation was almost imperceptible, accomplished in the hush of betrayal rather than the clamor of combat. The river reflected the dying light like molten gold, a reminder of the wealth and power that had shifted in whispers, promises, and subtle manipulations rather than the roar of armies. It was a day that spoke to the invisible currents of history, the way small forces, hidden agendas, and quiet treachery can shape the destiny of nations without fanfare or spectacle. And in the lingering silence, as the stars began to pierce the velvet sky, one could almost hear the murmurs of a fallen king, the sighs of soldiers caught in indecision, and the distant, ghostly laughter of ambition fulfilled. Plassey did not roar, it whispered. Its echoes traveled along the rivers, through the sugarcane fields, and into memory, a spectral reminder that history is often written not by overwhelming force, but by the invisible, delicate manipulation of loyalty and fear. The triumph was absolute, yet it was quiet, a soft, almost secretive turn of fate that would be felt for centuries, and beneath it all, the hum of life in Bengal persisted, unaware yet forever altered, a living witness to the subtle, haunting ways in which destiny can be bent, broken, and claimed. The sun vanished behind the horizon, leaving Kajarska's shadows pale in the dying light. As night deepened, the empire's pulse slowed, but its lessons lingered, that the smallest hands, guided by cunning and patience, can hold the fate of the greatest, that empires fall not always in battle's roar, but in the invisible hush of betrayal, and that the quietest currents, unseen and unheralded, carry the heaviest weight of history. Plassey remained etched in eternity, a place where silence and treachery wove a tapestry more enduring than any sword could carve, a reminder that in the grand symphony of the world, even whispers can orchestrate cataclysms. The dawn in April 1241 was pale and brittle, as if the heavens themselves had grown weary of light. Mist clung stubbornly to the rolling fields near Legnica, curling around the roots of oak trees and drifting over the shallow streams that stitched the Polish plains like silver threads. The air was damp with the memory of frost, carrying a chill that gnawed at bones and whispered uneasily through armor. Soldiers on both sides moved with careful deliberation, their breaths visible in the morning air. Yet none could sense the specter that hovered above the land, an unseen force that would decide the fate of Europe before it fully understood the threat approaching from the east. The European host, proud and confident, had gathered under banners emblazoned with lions, eagles, and crosses, each insignia a testament to lineage, faith, and valor. Knights adjusted their gauntlets and tested the weight of their swords, polished. In the hope that strength alone could shield them from the storms of history, they stood in ranks, disciplined, steadfast, yet unaware of the enemy whose movements were as fluid and intangible as mist. Mongol cavalry had emerged from the vast steppes months before, creatures of wind and shadow, mounted on horses that seemed conjured from the air itself. Their archers loosed arrows and volleys that rained with almost supernatural precision. Their tactics honed not in the comfort of castles, but on endless plains where survival demanded cunning and speed. Burke, commander of the Mongols, orchestrated his maneuvers with a quiet deliberation that betrayed no emotion. Each feint, each retreat, each sudden charge was calculated to sow confusion, to unravel the confidence of those who measured might only by number and armor. The Europeans, unpracticed in the mercurial rhythm of Mongol warfare, advanced, only to find that every step was guided by unseen hands. Horses collided, formations collapsed, and the thunder of hoofs carried a sound that felt less like battle and more like prophecy being fulfilled. Knights, who had once believed their discipline invincible, found their ranks dissolving under the strange choreography of the steppes. Men vanished into smoke, dust, and blood, leaving no record but scattered shields and broken standards. The climax came as the sun pierced through the thinning mist, illuminating the chaos in stark relief. Entire squadrons were encircled and cut down before the horror of realization could set in. The ground was littered with bodies, yet the manner of their fall was almost ethereal, swift, silent, as though history had brushed away the ordinary mechanics of war to achieve a darker, more inscrutable effect. No trumpet heralded victory, no cannon declared dominance. Only the wind carried the echo of screams, fading into the mountains and forests like a half-remembered lament. In the aftermath, when the dust settled over the plains and the remaining forces fled in stunned silence, the Mongol cavalry vanished as mysteriously as it had arrived. leaving the land scarred but quiet. Europe trembled at the loss, uncertain how such a smaller, agile force could devastate an entire host with speed, precision, and an almost preternatural awareness of movement and terrain. The tale of Legnica passed into legend, a ghost story, of horsemen who struck from mist and vanished into memory, leaving only the whisper of their passage. And as night fell across the plains, the oak trees and streams seemed to absorb the weight of loss. The silence punctuated only by the distant cry of a raven, the battlefield held its breath, a sacred witness to the fragile balance between power and vulnerability, courage and inevitability. In that quiet, one could almost hear the pulse of history itself, how empires might crumble not with brute force, alone, but under the careful, unseen hand of those who understand the rhythms of chaos. Legnica endured, not merely as a place of slaughter, but as a timeless testament to strategy, fear, and the ethereal, haunting power of shadowed cavalry that moved like wind across the world. Here, amid mist and blood, one feels the eerie intimacy of fate, the way life and death can entwine in silence, and how the smallest ripple of cunning can drown the mightiest tide. Legnica does not roar in memory, it whispers, echoing through centuries, a quiet admonition to those who would measure power by size alone, and a reminder that some victories are willed by shadow and speed, leaving only silence to testify to the grandeur of their consequence. The fields of Gascony in July 1453 were drenched in a heat that seemed to slow time itself, a heavy, languid sun pressing down upon the land as if the earth had grown weary of centuries of war. The soil, parched in patches and soft with recent rains in others, lay between low hills and gentle valleys, carrying the faint scent of grass and blood-soaked memories from battles long past. Birds circled overhead in uneasy silence, their wings cutting through the humid air as though wary of the violence brewing below. And in this quiet, the final chapter of the 100 Years' War was poised, not with grand trumpets and booming drums, but with the slow, almost imperceptible breath of inevitability. The English army, stiff and proud, stood upon the fields with banners snapping in the slight wind, the weight of tradition and expectation heavy upon their shoulders. There, men at arms bore polished armor that gleamed in the summer light, each figure a testament to the centuries of conflict that had shaped them. Across the valley, the French forces gathered under the command of Jean Bureau, his mind sharp as any blade, his strategy honed by years of observing the quiet evolution of warfare. Yet what made this confrontation extraordinary and what would etch Castellon into memory was not the size of the armies, but the unseen hand of innovation that lay hidden in the French ranks. Artillery, still a new and terrifying force, was arrayed upon the gentle rise of a hill, cannons gleaming and prepared to roar in a way that no soldier of either nation had fully anticipated. When the first shot cracked through the morning calm, it was not simply a cannon firing, it was the sound of a new age asserting itself, a thunder unlike any that had fallen upon European fields before. The English, confident in their traditional charge, pressed forward across the uneven ground, their horses and men caught between anticipation and momentum. And then, the French unleashed the full weight of their artillery, a storm of iron and fire that tore through armor and flesh alike. Horses collapsed in the dust, knights were thrown into disarray, and the rhythm of battle fractured into a series of spasms, each moment more chaotic than the last. John Talbot, the Earl of Shrewsbury, galloped into the fray with his usual courage, yet even his valor could not withstand the combination of innovation and precision. Fate seemed to ride with the cannonballs, each shot guiding history in a direction that no human planning alone could fully explain. The field became a theater of panic, of splintered lines and screaming men. It was a strange kind of carnage, mechanical, inevitable, almost silent in its methodical devastation compared to the tumult of traditional combat. When the sun climbed high and the smoke finally began to thin, Castellon was no longer a field of preparation, but a graveyard of expectation. Where the old order had met the inexorable force of change, Talbot fell amidst the chaos, and with his death, the last great English commander of the war succumbed to the inevitability of history's quiet revolution. The 100 Years' War had ended, not with a roar, but with the measured precision of a new age stepping quietly across centuries-old soil. In the days that followed, as the French solidified their position and the English retreated, the true impact of Castellon became evident. The battlefield lay strewn with remnants of hope, ambition, and the shattered illusion of invincibility. Dust and smoke settled over broken banners, and the scent of gunpowder lingered like a spectral haze In the stillness, the land seemed to remember each moment, whispering of the inexorable passage of time, of empires bending under the subtle pressure of ingenuity and circumstance. Rather than brute force alone, Castellon was not merely the end of a war. It was the birth of a quiet mastery over history, a moment when the subtle, almost invisible hand of technology and strategy reshaped the destiny of nations. As evening fell and shadows stretched across the bloodied soil, the wind carried a lament through the hills, a song without melody, but rich with understanding. The echoes of the cannon, the silence after the charge, and the stillness of those who had fallen mingled into a single, timeless breath. It was in this hushed reverence that one could perceive the profound lesson of Castellon, that history bends as much to innovation, calculation, and the silent currents of change as it does to courage, loyalty, or valor. Empires rise and fall not only with the clashing of swords, but also with the quiet assertion of a new order, a revelation that the earth, and those who move upon it, will always remember. And the hills of Gascony, witness to this transformation, held their breath as if guarding the sacred knowledge that battles need not roar to alter the world. Sometimes they merely whisper. A low fog clung to the rolling hills of Champagne as dawn crept across the land in September of 1792. The earth was damp beneath heavy boots, soaked by recent rain and the slow exhalation of the night. Cannon stood silent on the ridgelines. There, dark mouths pointed toward an uncertain future, while men waited in long, trembling lines, wrapped in threadbare coats and raw conviction. The air carried the scent of wet soil, sweat, a fear and intimate perfume of history about to be rewritten. This was Valmy, a place unremarkable in its geography, yet destined to become sacred ground where the fate of an age would turn not with a scream, but with a pause. France was unraveling and remaking itself at once. The old world had begun to crack, its foundations splintering under the weight of revolution. And across the eastern frontier marched the disciplined armies of Prussia and Austria, intent on restoring a monarchy they believed had been merely misplaced, not destroyed. Their soldiers were veterans, hardened by campaigns and drilled into mechanical precision. They advanced with the confidence of inevitability, certain that these citizen soldiers of French shopkeepers, farmers, students would scatter at the first disciplined volley. Yet something in the air at Valmy resisted that certainty, an invisible tension that refused to resolve itself into the familiar patterns of conquest. The French army, hastily assembled and poorly supplied, stood its ground with an unfamiliar stillness. Many had never seen battle. Their hands shook on musket stocks, their eyes darted between officers and the gray horizon. Yet beneath the fear was something raw and unnameable. It was not loyalty to a king, nor obedience to tradition, but a fierce, untested belief that the world could be different, that power might belong not to bloodlines but to voices. They stood in mud and mist not because they were ordered to, but because retreat felt like betrayal not of a ruler, but of an idea. When the first cannon fired, the sound rolled across the hills like distant thunder, deep and resonant, swallowed quickly by the fog. Shot answered shot, iron screaming through the air, tearing into earthworks and scattering clods of soil into the gray sky. Yet there was something strange about the exchange. It lacked the crescendo of annihilation, the relentless push of advancing lines. The Prussian army paused, its commanders watching through spyglasses as the French held firm, their lines bending but not breaking. Hours passed in this suspended state, artillery booming, smoke drifting, men falling yet no decisive movement followed. The battlefield seemed trapped in a moment of hesitation, as though history itself were uncertain which direction to take. The French did not charge, they did not retreat, they stood and endured, and in that endurance something profound took shape. The soldiers began to shout, not in fear, but in defiant cries of belief. Carried on the damp wind, voices rising from the fog like a chorus summoned from the earth itself. It was not a coordinated maneuver, not a tactical brilliance that shifted the day, but a collective refusal to yield. The Prussian commanders, seasoned and pragmatic, felt the weight of that refusal. Disease had begun to creep through their ranks, supply lines stretched thin, and the weather turned against them. The cost of pressing forward suddenly seemed heavier than the reward. As the day wore on, the cannon fire slowed, smoke thinned. The fog lifted just enough to reveal what had not changed. The French still stood. No grand charge had shattered the enemy, no sweeping maneuver had sealed victory. Yet something irreversible had occurred. The Prussian army began to withdraw, step by measured step, their retreat cautious, almost respectful. It was a decision that baffled observers then and later alike. How could a battle with so little movement, so little bloodshed compared to others, alter the course of Europe? How could a moment defined by stillness carry such weight? When night fell, the fields of Valmy lay quiet under a sky bruised with cloud and fading smoke. The dead were gathered, the wounded tended, and the living sat in exhausted silence, unsure of what they had survived. Yet within that quiet, a new world had quietly announced itself. The following day, in Paris, the monarchy was abolished. The Republic was proclaimed. The echo of Valmy reached far beyond the hills where it had been fought, carried not by conquest, but by conviction. It told the world that an army of citizens could stand against kings. That belief could stiffen spines where training had not yet reached. What remains haunting about Valmy is not the violence it contained, but the violence it withheld. It was a battle that resisted spectacle, that unfolded like a held breath rather than a scream. Historians still circle its mystery, weighing logistics against morale, whether against strategy. Yet none can fully capture the moment when hesitation tipped into retreat, when certainty dissolved into doubt. The field itself offers no answers, only silence and the memory of men who stood their ground without fully understanding why they were strong enough to do so in the long centuries since. Valmy has faded from popular memory, overshadowed by battles louder, bloodier, more easily framed as triumphs or disasters. Yet its power endures in subtler ways. It reminds us that history does not always pivot on the edge of a sword. Sometimes it turns on endurance, on the quiet courage to remain standing when every instinct urges flight. Sometimes the most profound victories are those that leave no clear scar on the land, only a tremor in the future. As the fog of that September morning dissolved into daylight, the hills returned to their ordinary silence, unaware of the burden they now carried. Grass grew. Again where cannonballs had fallen, the soil absorbed the memory of fear and resolve alike. And in that unassuming landscape, one could still sense the hush of a moment when the world paused, listened, and chose a different path, not with thunder, but with the soft, unmistakable sound of resolve refusing to move. Night faded slowly over a narrow mountain pass in northern Greece, where stone walls rose like ribs from the earth and the wind whispered through scrub and pine. The path was so tight that two men could barely walk abreast, a corridor of rock funneling armies into vulnerability. Long before dawn, torches flickered against the cliffs, casting restless shadows that danced like ghosts of older wars. This was Thermopylae, not yet a legend, not yet a symbol, but a place holding its breath as history gathered itself in silence. The Persian Empire stretched vast and confident, its armies moving like a tide drawn by destiny. They came with banners, drums, and numbers so immense they seemed to mock resistance itself. Chroniclers would later struggle to describe them without reaching for the language of myth. And yet here, in this narrow throat of land, that immensity meant little. Stone erased advantage. Geography became judgment. And waiting within the pass stood a small force bound not by hope of victory, but by an understanding of inevitability. The Greeks knew the odds. Every man who took position between those cliffs understood that retreat was unlikely and survival uncertain. Yet there was no panic in their ranks, no frantic attempt to flee before the storm arrived. Instead, there was preparation, quiet, methodical, almost ritualistic. Armor was adjusted, weapons were checked, words were exchanged softly, not of fear, but of home. What compelled them to stay has puzzled historians for centuries. Was it loyalty to law, devotion to honor, or something deeper, an acceptance that some moments demand witness rather than survival? When the Persian advance began, it did not unfold as the invaders expected. Wave after wave surged into the pass, only to break against the disciplined resistance of men who had nowhere to go but forward. Spears locked, shields held, the air filled with the sound of metal striking metal, a relentless rhythm echoing off stone walls, amplifying each clash into something thunderous and intimate. For days, the impossible seemed to hold. An empire stalled. A narrow pass dictated terms to a force that had crushed nations. Yet Thermopylae's mystery does not live in how long the Greeks held, but in why their stand mattered after it ended. Betrayal opened a hidden path. Encirclement followed. Death came, as it always does, with brutal certainty. The defenders fell. One by one, the pass finally surrendered to overwhelming force. By every conventional measure, it was a defeat total, irreversible, and yet the world remembers it as something else entirely. The Persians marched on, but not unchanged. The delay had cost them time, morale, and the illusion of inevitability across Greece. The story spread not as a tale of annihilation, but of resistance. Cities that might have surrendered instead prepared, fleets gathered, resolve hardened. The battle that should have erased opposition instead ignited it, as though sacrifice itself had weight enough to bend the future. What lingers at Thermopylae is the paradox, a loss that behaved like a victory, a stand that should have vanished into obscurity, but instead echoed louder with each retelling. The rocks remember no names. The past offers no explanation. It only stands there, narrow and unyielding, a reminder that history does not always reward survival. Sometimes it crowns those who choose to remain when leaving would be easier. In the end, Thermopylae was not about holding ground. It was about holding meaning, and in that holding brief, brutal, and seemingly futile, the course of a civilization quietly shifted, carried forward by the memory of men who stood where retreat was possible, yet unchosen. The silence that followed the clash lingered longer than the sound of battle itself. Long after bodies cooled and weapons lay scattered like shed skins, the past remained quiet, as if the land were reluctant to speak of what it had witnessed. Wind moved gently through the corridor of stone, brushing over broken shields and darkened earth, carrying with it the faint iron scent of blood. Thermopylae did not celebrate. It mourned, and in that mourning, it preserved something fragile and powerful memory. Across the Aegean, the story traveled without banners or official decree. It moved in murmurs, carried by sailors and messengers, shaped by grief and awe. It was not told as a tale of numbers or tactics, but as an offering. Men spoke of how the defenders had known the end before it arrived, and how they stayed anyway. Parents repeated it to children, elders shared it in candlelit rooms. With each telling, the event grew less about the past itself and more about an idea that could not be killed with swords. The Persian army continued its march, immense and disciplined, yet subtly altered. Victory had come, but not the kind that settles the spirit. The narrow stones of Thermopylae had taught them something uncomfortable, that dominance could be delayed, that power could be resisted not by greater force, but by refusal to yield. The empire moved forward carrying this lesson like an unseen weight, a quiet doubt stitched into its triumph. Elsewhere, preparations began in earnest. Ships were built and repaired, alliances were strengthened. What Thermopylae bought with blood was not land, but time, the most elusive and valuable currency of war. And time allowed resolve to harden into action. When future battles came, they were fought not in isolation, but in the long shadow of that narrow pass, where a small stand had proven that inevitability was not absolute. Yet the deepest mystery of Thermopylae does not belong to strategy or consequence. It lives within the men themselves, in the moment before the final encirclement, when escape was offered and refused. What passed through their minds then cannot be recovered. Fear must have been present. No mortal is without it, but so too must have been clarity, a sense that their lives had narrowed, like the past itself, into a single purpose. Perhaps they understood that some moments demand witnesses, rather than survivors. That history, like the land, remembers pressure points, places where choice becomes meaning. In choosing to stay, they transformed the past into something more than stone and earth. They turned it into a threshold, a place where the ordinary flow of time slowed, thickened, and absorbed sacrifice. Today, the rocks still stand. The sea still breathes nearby. Travelers walk the path unaware of how close they tread to the weight of centuries. There are no cries, no clash of shields, only wind and the distant call of birds. And yet, if one listens carefully, there is a resonance beneath the quiet, a reminder that the past does not vanish. It settles. It waits. Thermopylae asks no questions and offers no answers. It simply exists as proof that history can pivot not on conquest, but on conviction. That silence can be louder than victory, and that sometimes the most powerful force an empire can face is a handful of people who decide that the ground beneath their feet is worth everything they have. The square at Cajamarca did not echo with triumph. It absorbed sound, swallowing it into stone and dust, as though the earth itself were stunned by what had occurred. When the shouting faded and the smoke thinned, there was no battlefield in the familiar sense, no long lines of fallen soldiers locked in combat. There was only confusion, scattered bodies, trampled gold, and the unimaginable sight of an emperor alive, yet bound. The Inca nobles lay where they had fallen, unarmed and bewildered, their blood dark against the pale ground. The silence that followed was not peace, it was disbelief made audible. Atahualpa was led away under guard, his litter abandoned like a discarded symbol. for a people who believed their ruler was bound to the order of the cosmos. This moment cracked the sky. The sun still rose, the mountains did not move, and yet something essential had been severed. The world no longer made sense. How could the son of the sun be captured by so few? By strangers whose faces were pale and whose weapons spat fire? The question hung unanswered, drifting through the Andes like ash. Within the stone walls that now held him, Atahualpa watched the conquerors with a measured calm that unsettled them. He spoke, observed, calculated. He offered a ransom beyond comprehension, rooms filled to the height of a raised hand with gold and silver, and the empire obeyed. From distant temples and sacred storehouses, treasures were stripped and carried across mountains. Objects meant for gods were melted down, their shapes erased, their meanings reduced to weight. All the while, the emperor waited, trusting that logic still governed human affairs. That exchange could restore balance, but Cajamarca had already proven that balance was an illusion. The ransom was paid, the rooms were filled, and still, the chains remained. What followed was not a battle, but a ritual of fear disguised as judgment. Accusations were spoken in a language the accused barely understood, charges of treason, idolatry, rebellion, words stacked like stones to justify what had already been decided. When Atahualpa was executed, the Andes did not roar, they fell quiet. Even nature seemed to withdraw, unwilling to witness the final unraveling. His death did not end resistance, but it unmoored it. Without the living axis of empire, the Inca world fractured, generals fought on, cities fell, roads that once carried runners bearing news of unity now carried rumors of collapse. Cajamarca had not conquered the Andes in a single night, but it had introduced doubt into a system built on certainty, and doubt, once planted, spread faster than armies. What remains mysterious is not that the Inca fell, but how swiftly belief dissolved. Was it the shock of the ambush, the terror of unfamiliar weapons, or the deeper wound of seeing the divine rendered mortal? Perhaps empires do not crumble when walls are breached, but when meaning is broken, when the stories that hold a people together are interrupted mid-sentence. Cajamarca still rests beneath the same sky. The plaza is quiet now, its stones warmed by ordinary sun. Travelers pass through unaware that the fate of continents once turned there without a roar. And in that quiet, the lesson lingers. History does not always announce itself with thunder. Sometimes it arrives softly, disguised as a meeting, and leaves behind a silence so profound that the world spends centuries trying to understand what it lost in that single, stunned breath. Mist clung to the forest like a held breath. It wrapped itself around trunks and branches, dampened sound, softened distance, and turned direction into a suggestion rather than a certainty. This was not a place that welcomed order. Paths dissolved into mud, light fractured through leaves in uneasy fragments. Somewhere beneath the canopy, the land waited, ancient and patient, as though it had seen empires come before and learned the art of watching without warning. It was the year the Romans believed the world was already theirs. Roads stitched continents together, eagles flew above disciplined legions, law, language, and steel marched in step, and with them came the confidence that resistance was merely delay. Beyond the Rhine, they saw not a threat, but a future province forest to be cleared, tribes to be catalogued, borders to be drawn in straight lines where none had existed before. Germania, they called it, a name spoken with the casual assurance of ownership. Publius Quinctilius Varus carried that assurance with him as he moved eastward. He was not advancing into hostile territory, not in his mind. He was administering order. With him marched 3 full legions, auxiliaries, families, camp followers, an entire moving world of Roman certainty. They advanced slowly, burdened not by fear, but by expectation, believing themselves unopposed. Believing the land already subdued by the idea of Rome itself, they trusted Arminius. He was one of them, or so it seemed, a Germanic noble raised within Roman systems, fluent in their language, trained in their warfare, honored with their citizenship. He rode beside Varus not as a captive, but as an ally. His armor bore Roman design, his posture Roman discipline. And yet beneath that borrowed order lived a memory older than empire and knowledge of forests that did not bend to maps, of silence that could be sharpened into a weapon. The warning signs were subtle. Reports of unrest arrived like distant echoes, easily dismissed. Varus adjusted course, moving deeper into wooded terrain to address what he believed were minor disturbances. The weather turned against them, rain fell, relentless and cold, soaking armor, swelling rivers. turning ground into resistance itself. Columns stretched thin along narrow paths. Shields grew heavy, discipline strained beneath exhaustion. Then, the forest began to move, not all at once, not with a roar. It began with the absence of birdsong, the sudden sense that sound itself had been swallowed. Then came small strikes, quick and vanishing, a javelin from nowhere, a scream cut short, a body pulled into undergrowth and erased. The legions tightened formation, but the land refused their geometry. Trees stood too close. Mud broke their footing. Orders dissolved before they could reach the end of a line. What followed was not a single battle, but days of unraveling. The Romans could not see their enemy. They could not pursue, could not retreat, could not rest. Every attempt to build a camp was interrupted. Every clearing became a trap. Germanic warriors appeared and vanished like spirits, striking from higher ground, from behind roots and fallen trunks, from places the Romans did not think to look. The forest was no longer terrain. It was an accomplice. Varus struggled to impose control, but command itself became a burden. Messengers died before reaching their destination. Standards fell. Cohesion, Rome's greatest weapon, fractured into isolated pockets of fear and resistance. Soldiers fought bravely, stubbornly, as they always had, but bravery without direction is easily consumed by chaos. And chaos, in this place, belonged to those who knew its language. Rain continued, armor rusted, wounds festered, food ran low, hope thinned with each step. The realization came slowly and then all at once. This was not a setback. This was an ending. The legions were not delayed. They were being erased. When Varus understood fully, it was already too late. Surrounded, cut off, stripped of the possibility of honor as Rome defined it, he chose silence over spectacle. His death did not rally the troops. It marked the moment when Rome certainly collapsed inward. Without command, resistance fragmented. Some fought until exhaustion claimed them. Others were captured, sacrificed, or enslaved. Very few escaped the trees. By the time the forest grew quiet again, 3 legions had ceased to exist. News traveled slowly back to Rome, as if reluctant to be spoken. When it arrived, it struck, not as grief alone, but as disbelief. An empire that had measured itself in conquest suddenly faced absence gaps. Where legions should have been, standards that would never return. Augustus himself is said to have wandered his palace calling Varus's name into the night, as though repetition might undo reality. But the forest did not answer. What made this defeat unbearable was not the loss of men, but the loss of illusion. Rome had believed itself inevitable. Teutoburg revealed the limits of that belief. It showed that power could be undone not by greater force, but by understanding by a land and a people refusing to become legible to empire. In the years that followed, Rome would strike back, hard and methodically. Villages burned. Retribution came in familiar forms, but something fundamental had shifted. The Rhine became not a temporary line, but a boundary. Expansion hesitated. Ambition learned caution. The forest had spoken, and Rome had listened. Today, Teutoburg does not announce itself. The trees stand ordinary, the paths walkable, the air unremarkable. Yet beneath the soil lie remnants, rusted metal, shattered bone, fragments of a certainty that once believed it could tame anything it touched. The forest keeps its secrets well. It always has. And perhaps that is the lesson it offers, whispered, rather than declared, that some places cannot be conquered without first being understood. And some silences are not empty at all. They are full of endings, waiting patiently for those who mistake quiet for consent. Long after the last cries faded and the wounded were gathered into the dark, the forest returned to itself. Rain softened to a whisper. Leaves stirred as they always had. The land showed no sign of the violence it had absorbed, as though it had merely shrugged off an irritation. This indifference was perhaps the cruelest truth Rome would never fully accept, that the world beyond its borders did not recognize its losses as extraordinary. The survivors who emerged from the trees carried more than physical scars. They carried a fracture in belief. Rome had taught its soldiers that order was universal, that discipline could bend chaos into submission. Teutoburg exposed a flaw in that creed. The forest had no interest in order, and the people who called it home had learned to move within its indifference. Against that, straight lines and shouted commands meant very little. For the Germanic tribes, the victory was not celebrated with monuments or written proclamations. It lived in memory, in songs spoken low round fires, in the knowledge that the great machine of the South could bleed Arminius himself would not enjoy peace for long. Power gained through unity is fragile when forged from many wills. Rivalries returned. Suspicion followed. The man who had undone Rome would one day fall to his own kin. A reminder that triumph does not guarantee belonging. Yet his act had already done its quiet work. The map of Europe bent around that forest. The Roman world, so confident in its forward motion, learned to hesitate. Forts replaced roads. Defense replaced expansion. What had been imagined as a temporary frontier hardened into permanence. The Rhine became not just a river, but a psychological edge of line beyond which certainty dissolved into shadow. Teutoburg changed history not through conquest, but through refusal. It did not birth an empire or crown a king. It simply said no, and in doing so, altered the direction of a civilization. The absence of Roman rule in the north shaped languages, cultures, and identities that would echo through centuries. All of it traced back to a place where the trees stood too close together, and the ground would not cooperate. Even now, when the forest is walked by hikers and scholars, there is a heaviness. Beneath the quiet, not fear, but awareness. A sense that the land remembers what people prefer to forget, that power is temporary. That confidence can become blindness, and that silence can be sharpened into a weapon. Teutoburg offers no spectacle. There are no towering ruins, no grand arenas. Its lesson is subtle, almost easy to miss, but it endures all the same, carried in the idea that history is not always written by those who advance the furthest, but sometimes by those who choose the right moment to let an empire wander, just a little too deep into the dark. Beyond the forest, seasons turned as they always do, indifferent to the meaning humans attach to time. Grass grew where blood had soaked the soil. Roots wrapped themselves around fragments of armor and bone, claiming them without ceremony. The land did not preserve the dead as relics. It folded them inward, reducing empire to nourishment. And in that quiet consumption, Teutoburg completed its work. Rome rebuilt what it could not forget. New legions were raised. Standards were reforged. Commanders marched to the edge of the Rhine and stared northward into the green shadow that had swallowed certainty whole. They crossed the river again, briefly, with fire and vengeance, carving scars into villages and forests alike. But these were gestures, not destiny. The deep ambition, the dream of endless expansion had been tempered. Rome no longer walked forward without glancing at the ground. For those who lived beyond the river, the victory lingered not as triumph, but as permission to remain undefined, to resist being counted, taxed, absorbed. The forest became more than shelter. It became identity, a living boundary that refused straight roads and tidy borders. Generations grew up knowing, even if only faintly, that their world had once halted the greatest power they could imagine, not with walls or armies, but with patience and understanding. Time, as it does, softened the edges of the story. Details blurred, numbers shifted, names faded. What remained was feeling, a shared sense that silence could be chosen, that waiting could be an act of strength. Empires rose and fell elsewhere with greater noise, louder collapses, brighter flames. Teutoburg never needed spectacle. Its power lived in restraint, and perhaps that is why it still unsettles. It reminds us that history is not only shaped by ambition, but by refusal, that not every turning point announces itself with ceremony. Some arrive disguised as bad weather, poor information, a trusted guide whose loyalty runs deeper than appearances. Some arrive quietly, wrapped in leaves and mist, and leave behind nothing but absence and a question that echoes long after the answer has been buried. The forest stands still now, as forests always do, but stillness is not emptiness. Beneath the calm lies memory, not carved into stone, not sung loudly, but held in the dark soil where footsteps once faltered. Teutoburg does not demand remembrance. It does not warn. It simply endures, offering its lesson to anyone willing to listen closely enough to silence. That empires do not always fall in fire. Sometimes they lose their way, and so the story settles into its final quiet, the kind that does not close a wound but seals it beneath layers of time. The Roman world learned to live with what it could not undo. Generations later, children would be taught of distant victories, of marble cities and disciplined legions, while the name of that forest would be spoken more softly, if at all. Yet omission is its own form of remembrance. What is avoided often carries the deepest weight. In the north, the land kept shaping the people who belonged to it. Rivers flooded and receded. Winters hardened resolve. Communities rose and fell. without ever fully knowing how close they had come to being absorbed into something vast and alien. Their future unfolded along a different rhythm, less ordered, perhaps, but their own. Languages branched where uniformity might have taken root. Customs survived that would have been sanded smooth by law and decree. All of it owed its fragile persistence to a moment when an empire stepped where it did not belong. Tobruk teaches, without instruction, it does not glorify violence or promise salvation through resistance. It simply reveals a truth that history repeats in quieter forms, that power depends on understanding, and that ignorance, no matter how confident, carries consequences. The Romans did not lose because they were weak. They lost because they believed the world would behave as it always had. The Fars corrected that belief without argument. As centuries passed, new empires would rise, each convinced of its own permanence. Theta would meet places that did not yield easily, deserts that swallowed armies, mountains that slowed ambition, seas that scattered fleets into silence. Each time, the lesson was the same, though rarely learned in full, that control is conditional, that dominance is temporary, that the world has edges where certainty frays. Standing at the edge of that ancient forest today, one might feel nothing at all. The air is ordinary, the ground is firm, birds move freely between branches, and yet, if the noise of the present is allowed to fade, there is a subtle pressure in the quieter reminder that this place once held its ground without lifting a wall. History often remembers its turning points through monuments and names etched in stone. Tobruk offers neither. It leaves behind only a pause in expansion, a bend in destiny, and a silence that refuses to explain itself, and perhaps that is why it endures so completely. Because some moments are not meant to be understood in full. They are meant to be felt, like a path that suddenly disappears beneath one's feet, or a certainty that vanishes into trees and never quite comes back. The silence deepens the longer one lingers there. It is not the empty quiet of abandonment, but a layered stillness, as if sound itself has been asked to tread carefully. Even the wind seems to hesitate before passing through the branches. In that hesitation lives the echo of what once unfolded, of footsteps that moved forward with confidence and never returned, of plans spoken aloud that dissolved into the damp air before they could take shape. Time has a way of softening even the sharpest moments, but it does not erase them. It presses them down, compresses them until they become part of the ground itself. Into Tobruk, the earth remembers and fragments, a bent piece of iron surfaced by rain, a pale sliver of bone turned up by a root, a depression in the soil where wheat once fell and did not rise again. These are not monuments. They are whispers, barely above nothing at all. What Rome lost here was not only legions, but a particular confidence, the belief that the world could be mastered simply by naming it. After Tobruk, names became more cautious. Borders were drawn with heavier hands. Ambition learned to negotiate with uncertainty. The empire endured, yes, but altered, carrying within it the memory of a place where certainty had been dismantled without ceremony. And perhaps that is why the forest remains so unsettling. It does not proclaim victory. It does not demand reverence. It offers no clear moral, no simple lesson to be repeated. Instead, it asks something quieter and more difficult: attention, to listen without expecting an answer, to accept that some forces operate beyond command, beyond even understanding. The men who died there did not know they would become a turning point. They believed they were marching through a subdued land, toward another routine conclusion of Roman order. History rarely announces itself to those inside it. Meaning is assigned later, by those who sift through the silence and attempt to shape it into story. But the forest does not participate in that shaping. It keeps what it knows. As night settles over the trees, shadows stretch and merge, erasing the distinction between one trunk and the next. Direction becomes uncertain again, and in that uncertainty, the past feels closer, not as memory, but as presence. A reminder that power walks on borrowed ground, and that the world does not always announce when it is about to say no. Tobruk begins where it began, in quiet, not the quiet of peace, but of endurance, a quiet that waits, patient and unchanged, for the next certainty to wander too far from its own understanding. Eventually, even the desire to explain begins to fade. Words feel inadequate here, too blunt for something shaped by patience and shadow. The forest does not correct misunderstandings, it allows them. It stands as it always has, indifferent to interpretation, uninterested in legacy. What happened within it was not staged for remembrance. It simply occurred, and the world adjusted around it. Perhaps that is the most enduring unease Tobruk leaves behind. not the violence, nor even the loss, but the realization that history can pivot without spectacle, that a civilization can be redirected by rain, by trees, by trust misplaced, and silence misunderstood. The legions did not fall to a grand opposing empire, but to a convergence of land, timing, and knowledge forces that asked for no permission. In this way, Tobruk feels less like an ending and more like a warning written in absence. It reminds us that dominance is a dialogue, not a decree, that certainty, when carried too far, becomes weight, and that some places, when entered without listening, will answer in ways no map prepares you for. The forest keeps breathing, roots deepen, leaves fall and return. Nothing announces what once happened here, and yet nothing denies it either. The silence remains intact, complete, unbroken, a final testament to the idea that history does not always need a voice to be heard. Sometimes, it only needs the patience to wait until someone notices what is missing. Beyond the forest, the world moved on as it always does. Rivers carved their courses, mountains endured seasons. Cities rose and fell, empires shifted, and yet Tobruk remained quiet, unchanging, almost invisible to those who passed through without heed. And perhaps that is its truest power. It did not need to dominate to endure. It only needed to exist. The land itself had asserted authority, shaping events not with swords, but with patience, with geometry, with the refusal to be imposed upon. Roman historians would recount the disaster in measured words, attempting to translate absence into numbers, defeat into lessons. Yet no chronicle could capture the lived experience of the forest. The way sound travels differently among trees, the way paths vanish without warning, the way fear becomes tangible when men understand they are surrounded by what cannot be fully known. These details did not survive in official accounts. They survive only in the echo of understanding and intuition that history can sometimes be rewritten, not by force, but by refusal. Generations later, the rhyme would mark more than a boundary. It would become a symbol of restraint, of the limits of expansion, of the idea that even the greatest power is humbled when it confronts knowledge beyond its own. And the forest, unchanged, would continue to claim what it had always held, the capacity to turn confidence into hesitation, order into confusion, certainty into silence. The tragedy and the triumph coexist in that quiet space. Men were lost, lives extinguished. Yet an empire learned caution, ideas were born, boundaries hardened, cultures preserved, all because a narrow corridor of trees refused to be dominated, because one man's understanding of his land shaped the fate of nations, because patience, like shadow, can move with inexorable force. Standing there now, centuries later, one feels only the weight of observation. The ground is uneven. Leaves rustle without pattern. Wind brushes against the skin with casual insistence. And in that subtle resistance lies the lesson. Power is never absolute. Certainty is always provisional. And some victories are written not in triumph, but in quiet, enduring absence. Tobruk does not demand remembrance. It whispers it, waiting patiently for those who will listen, teaching without speaking, and enduring beyond all the empires that believe themselves eternal. The first light of dawn broke over the rolling hills of Champagne, softening the horizon with shades of gray and rose. As if the world were reluctant to awaken fully, the earth was damp with dew, and the air carried a chill that seeped into bones, brushing against the soldiers gathered there. Like a premonition, this was Valmy, September of 1792, a quiet stretch of French countryside that would soon host a confrontation unlike any other, one that would reshape a nation. Without the spectacle of thunderous cavalry charges or rivers of blood, here, history would pivot in the hush between heartbeat and cannon blast, in the pregnant pause of men who did not yet know they were about to define the fate of an age. France, newly unmoored from monarchy, stood fragile yet resolute. Citizen soldiers, many untested and poorly supplied, gathered on the ridges and plains, their muskets trembling in unpracticed hands, their eyes wide with apprehension and determination. They were farmers, artisans, tradesmen, all called to serve a cause larger than themselves, a republic that existed more in idea than in law, more in hope than in armor. Opposite them, the disciplined armies of Prussia and Austria advanced with grim certainty, their lines long and precise, the spoils of years of warfare carried in every polished breastplate, in every drumbeat that echoed like the march of inevitability. Yet what set Valmy apart was not the grandeur of formation, nor the weight of numbers, but the strange, almost sacred stillness that pervaded the battlefield. The French, though inexperienced, did not flee at the sight of professional soldiers. They did not crumble under the precision of marching ranks. Instead, they held, absorbing the weight of expectation and transforming it into resolve. The land itself seemed to lean in, listening, as though aware that something extraordinary might unfold in its quiet folds. Mist curled along hedgerows. Dew gleamed on blades of grass. A fragile tension settled over every ridge, every fold of valley, as if time itself were pausing to witness the unlikeliest of acts. When the first cannon fire erupted, it rolled across the hills like distant thunder, shaking leaves from trees and rattling the nerves of men on both sides. Smoke and the scent of gunpowder drifted low to the ground, mingling with the morning fog, twisting perception and stretching the boundaries between fear and courage. Shot after shot rang. Yet the French lines remained intact, bending without, breaking, holding not through skill alone, but through the collective force of belief. Their voices rose in uncoordinated cries, a chorus of defiance that was neither planned nor rehearsed. Yet it carried a resonance deeper than discipline or fear. The Prussian commanders, watching from high ground, saw hesitation bloom in their ranks, a subtle fracture in the armor of certainty. Hours passed like this, each minute taut with suspense. Neither side pressed fully, neither advanced with reckless intent. The battlefield was neither won nor lost in the traditional sense. It existed as a liminal space where willpower and patience wielded more force than strategy alone. Slowly, imperceptibly, the tide shifted. The Prussian army, burdened by disease, supply shortages, and an unfamiliar terrain, began to withdraw, their retreat measured but inevitable. Valmy, without dramatic cavalry charges or monumental loss, had achieved what so many great battles could not. It had stopped an empire in its tracks. When night fell, the French troops stood quietly upon the ridges, exhausted, bloodied, yet undefeated in spirit. The fields lay scarred not with rivers of death, but with the residue of tension-spent gunpowder, trampled grass, and the faint echoes of 1,000 unsteady hearts. The Republic would declare itself the following day. Monarchy, once an unquestioned certainty, would vanish from the French consciousness, all because a handful of citizen soldiers chose to endure, to hold, to stand in the face of the seemingly inevitable. The true mystery of Valmy, still pondered by historians, is not its tactical genius, but its essence, a victory born of stillness, of refusal, of collective resolve. It was a battle where courage and hesitation intertwined, where absence of retreat became presence of power, and where the soft murmur of determination could alter the course of nations. The hills of Champagne, now quiet, still hold the memory of that day, a witness to a moment when the world paused, inhaled, and was quietly, irrevocably changed. The morning mist hung thick over the hills of the Scottish borders, draping the landscape in a soft, suffocating gray, as if the earth itself were holding its breath. It was September of 1513, and the air carried the scent of wet heather, damp soil, and anticipation too subtle to name. Soldiers stirred quietly in the low light, their armor muffled by fog, their breath visible in clouds that mingled with smoke from distant campfires. This was Flodden Field, a stretch of land neither grand nor inviting, yet destined to witness a confrontation that would echo through kingdoms, not with the roar of triumph, but with the slow, inexorable toll of loss. Scotland, under King James IV, approached the day with fervent certainty, a monarch both revered and ambitious. James led his army south with a confidence steeped in loyalty, honor, and the expectation of victory. Across the undulating fields, the English forces, disciplined and methodical under Thomas Howard, Earl of Surrey, awaited. Though fewer in number, their training, cohesion, and awareness of terrain led them a quiet, unseen advantage. The stage was set, yet the outcome was shrouded in ambiguity. As if history itself hesitated before the first strike, the Scottish advance unfolded like a slow, deliberate ritual. Knights in plate and mail moved with precision, pikes bristling, banners lifting like fragile claims against the gray. Drums beat softly, keeping time, yet there was a tension behind each movement, an understanding that something in the rhythm of the battlefield could shift in an instant. The mist obscured vision, bending perception, amplifying every noise into a whisper of impending fate. Horses snorted, armor clanged, and men adjusted grips on weapons, feeling the weight not just of steel, but of history pressing down upon them. The clash, when it came, was not sudden, but drawn out, a grinding testament to planning and endurance. Pikes met, shields, horses stumbled and churned mud. The fog twisted the lines of battle into something almost unreal, a painting of motion and fear where the living and dying merged into indistinct shapes. The Scottish army, proud and relentless, pushed forward with valor, yet the landscape itself worked against them. Slope and stream, mud and grass became silent adversaries. Turning the tide subtly but irreversibly, each misstep amplified the danger. Each hesitation magnified the consequences. By midday, the cost was clear. James IV, towering among his men, fell in the midst of the chaos, a king struck down not in dramatic isolation, but swallowed into the undifferentiated movement of a battle that refused clear lines. His death did not end the fight instantly. Scottish resistance lingered stubbornly. Yet without their king, the cohesion of command unraveled. Soldiers fell, banners toppled, and the field, once alive with anticipation, sank into grim inevitability. Yet the true horror was not in the spectacle of carnage, but in the quiet unraveling, the slow dissolution of order. The creeping awareness that honor and strategy could not overcome geography, misjudgment, and chance fought and survives in memory, not merely as a defeat, but as a reflection on the fragility of certainty. The hills bear no monuments, only subtle undulations where courage and miscalculation met. The fog returns each year, a veil over the fields, and with it, the echo of a moment when an entire kingdom's ambition was consumed not with grandeur, but with quiet inevitability. The silence that followed, filled with mourning and retreat, reminds us that history often shifts not in thunder, but in the soft, inexorable collapse of expectation. The dawn over northern France was pale and uncertain, a thin light seeping through clouded skies that threatened rain. The fields around Agincourt were sodden, churned by recent storms into a patchwork of mud and puddles that swallowed the footsteps of men before they could settle. It was October 25, 1415, and the English army, weary from a march across Normandy, arrived with tired horses, tattered banners, and soldiers whose armor clinked like brittle promise. Opposite them, the French amassed in far greater numbers nobles and knights, proud in polished steel, their confidence radiating through ranks as though sheer presence could bend fate. And yet, the stage was set for something neither side could fully anticipate, a battle that would echo not in grandeur, but in the quiet, inexorable mechanics of chance, endurance, and resolve. King Henry V stood among his men, a figure small in stature, but immense in authority, surveying the field with a gaze that measured not only the enemy, but the land itself. The English knew the disadvantage of numbers, yet they carried a weapon beyond steel, the longbow. Its simple elegance promised death at distance, a whispering menace invisible in the fog. Meanwhile, the French, intoxicated by abundance, pressed forward with arrogance, expecting momentum and might to overwhelm fatigue and mud. The fields themselves seemed complicit, narrowing between woods, forcing lines into unnatural tension, bending strategy towards something subtle, almost imperceptible, yet lethal. When the battle commenced, it did not unfold like the charge of heralded armies in song or story. Horses floundered in mud, knights sank to their knees, banners twisted and fell. Arrows descended like invisible rain, striking silently yet decisively, turning the pride of armor into ragged heaps of flesh and iron. French momentum faltered under its own weight. Mass became a liability as the battlefield, sodden and narrow, amplified misstep and hesitation. Henry's men advanced with grim patience, stepping carefully, pulling advantage from disorder rather than brute force. Every movement mattered. Every pause allowed history to bend slightly in favor of endurance, skill, and cunning. By midday, the field bore little resemblance to expectation. The French numbers had been vast, confident, insurmountable, or so they believed. Yet terrain, weather, and the subtle orchestration of what the English could achieve turned size into hindrance. Nobles fell in disproportionate numbers. Command faltered. The hierarchy of expectation collapsed quietly like a whispered betrayal. Henry's triumph was not in the noise of battle alone, but in the orchestration of what remained unseen, the careful exploitation of every hesitation, every moment where pride met mud and precision overcame hubris. When the last cries faded, the field of Agincourt lay scarred and sodden, silent except for the whisper of wind through reeds and broken wood. England had achieved an impossible victory, yet the scale of slaughter was hushed, almost private. There were no parades of glory. There was only survival, endurance, and the slow realization of what had been accomplished. The French, bewildered and broken, had succumbed not entirely to force, but to circumstance. the quiet manipulation of the elements, to an understanding of the land that Henry and his commanders had mastered. Agincourt endures in history not for spectacle, but for the quiet precision of disaster transformed into victory. The field offers no monuments of triumph, only undulations of sod and scattered stone that hint at a moment when numbers were overwhelmed by patience, ingenuity, and circumstance. Here, as elsewhere in history, the world teaches that battles are not always won by size, strength, or noise, but by perception, endurance, and the ability to harness the subtle, unseen forces that shape outcomes long before any trumpet calls or cries of war. The plaza of Cajamarca awoke slowly, as if reluctant to witness what was to unfold. The sun had just begun to gild the high Andes in pale gold, scattering light across red clay rooftops and the stone streets that had carried generations of footfalls. It was November of 1532, and the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, radiant in robes of gold, moved among his nobles with the quiet authority of one who believed himself untouchable. Around him, courtiers and attendants whispered, ranging ceremonial offerings and adjusting the glittering headdresses of warriors. The town itself seemed to hum with expectation, though none yet perceived the shadow that was about to descend. Francisco Pizarro and his men arrived not with the roar of conquest, but with the subtle menace of inevitability. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, armed with steel, gunpowder, and the precision of long practice, slipped into the square as if the stones themselves had guided them. Atahualpa, surrounded by tens of thousands of unarmed warriors, regarded them with cautious curiosity, unaware that the machinery of empire could be undone not by force alone, but by the cunning of calculation and the weight of surprise. The plaza, vast yet constraining, became a stage upon which destiny would perform in silence. The encounter began with polite requests and the display of weapons, a fragile dance in which hesitation and observation interwove like threads of mist. And then, in a moment so swift it seemed orchestrated by fate itself, chaos erupted. The Spaniards struck with cold precision. Cavalry charged among the unarmed nobles, halting the rhythm of ceremony. Guns cracked through the thin Indian air. Steel met flesh with terrifying intimacy. Atahualpa, stunned, found himself captured in a single stroke, chains wrapping around him like a physical manifestation of disbelief. The Incas, once unshakable in their faith in divine protection, were left immobile, paralyzed by shock, unable to comprehend that the sons chosen could be ensnared in such a fleeting instant. What followed was not slaughter, at least not immediately, but the slow dismantling of a civilization's spine. The emperor's presence, now bound, became both a weapon and a lens through which the Spaniards exercised power. Gold and silver, collected for ransom, flowed from temples and storehouses, melted and measured, a tangible price for survival that would never save its giver. And yet, deeper than the material, there was the intangible fracture, the subtle loss of certainty, the quiet dissolution of authority, the moment when belief in invincibility faltered under the weight of strategic cunning. When Atahualpa was executed months later, the Andes did not scream. Mountains, wind, and river absorbed the silence, imprinting it upon memory and leaving the Inca world unmoored. Cities fractured, nobles contested succession. Roads once filled with runners bearing messages of unity now carried only rumor and panic. Empires do not always fall to thunderous attack. Sometimes they crumble under a soft, deliberate pressure, like the careful erosion of river banks over centuries. Cajamarca, small, sunlit, and suddenly alien, became the pivot upon which continents quietly shifted, a testament to the power of timing, surprise, and the fragility of certainty. In the centuries since, the square has returned to ordinary rhythms. Merchants trade, children play among the stones. Travelers pass unaware that this place once held the fate of an empire in a single, stunned moment. And yet, the Andes remember. The mountains hold the echo of disbelief, of gold that could not preserve life, of a ruler's chains resonating like a lament carried by wind. History's most profound transformations often arrive not in noise, but in the suspended silence. Between expectation and revelation, Cajamarca teaches that silence can conquer, that patience and strategy can outweigh numbers, and that even the sun itself may fall without warning. The Scottish hills lay shrouded in mist, a gray veil that blurred ridge and valley, river and road, as if the land itself sought to conceal what was about to occur. September 9, 1513, and the fields of Flodden stretched under a sky weighted with anticipation and unease. King James IV, resplendent in armor and full of resolve, rode among his nobles, his presence a beacon of confidence for men who revered both crown and warrior. Behind him, banners fluttered, pikes glinted, and the ground trembled with the weight of thousands of feet. Moving with both ceremony and the subtle rhythm of dread, the Scots believed themselves destined for triumph. Yet the land and the unseen eyes of fate conspired quietly, almost imperceptibly, to challenge their certainty. The English, under the command of Thomas Howard, the Earl of Surrey, awaited with calculated patience. Though outnumbered, they were disciplined and steady, their armor polished, their positions carefully chosen. Where the Scots saw opportunity, the English saw possibility, a narrow field, a headline expanse. A river cutting through low-lying land all rendered the pride of the larger army vulnerable. Mist moved between the ranks, softening the edges of expectation, turning confidence into hesitation. Flodden was a battlefield that demanded more than valor. It demanded awareness of the subtle forces of terrain, timing, and perception. When the armies met, the clash was not immediate thunder. It unfolded like a prolonged reckoning. Spears met swords in an endless, grinding motion. Horses floundered in mud churned by movement and rain. Mist concealed friends and enemies alike, making every swing uncertain, every charge a test of both. Courage and luck, the Scottish lines, though brave and unyielding, were funneled by the geography itself into points of vulnerability. Each step forward became an argument with the earth, each advance a dialogue with chance. And yet the men fought with unwavering conviction, sustaining belief against both numbers and circumstance. King James IV fell amid this chaotic tableau, not in a heroic flourish, but swallowed into the blur of bodies, steel, and mud. His death did not immediately end resistance, but it unraveled cohesion. The Scottish army, valiant yet leaderless, fragmented into pockets of struggle, and the inevitability of defeat seeped silently through the ranks. The landscape, once a passive stage, had become an active agent, shaping the outcome with quiet impartiality. The English, steady and observant, pressed just enough to convert the subtle advantages into decisive victory. Flodden's aftermath was hushed. Thousands lay dead, yet the field did not boast its horror with spectacle. The hills absorbed the grief and horror, carrying it in mist and soil. Scotland reeled, mourning not just the fallen, but the shattering of certainty, the revelation that courage, loyalty, and numbers, however great, could falter under the quiet orchestration of circumstance. The battlefield offered no clarity, only reflection that history's course is often altered not in grandiose displays, but in subtle fractures, in the spaces where expectation meets inevitability, and in the hush that follows the last cry. The morning of October 25, 1415, broke over northern France in a muted palette of gray and pale gold, the sky heavy with clouds that threatened rain yet delivered only a slow, persistent drizzle. The fields around Agincourt were sodden and treacherous, churned into mud by recent storms, and already crowded with the anxious movements of men who had traveled far and slept little. The English army, weary from weeks of marching and the stifling heat of summer roads, arrived with tired horses, bent banners, and armor that clinked like brittle promises. Across the same fields, the French forces gathered, proud, polished, and confident in numbers that dwarfed their opponents. Nobles rode in ornate steel, banners snapping taut in the wind, convinced that size alone could overwhelm. And yet, this confrontation would unfold quietly, almost invisibly, as circumstance, patience, and subtle strategy conspired to defy expectation. King Henry V, though small in stature, projected authority across the ranks of his men, a presence steadying the nerves of those who had never faced battle before. The English longbow, a simple but devastating weapon, promised to turn numbers against themselves. Mud and narrow paths, inconvenient though they seemed, became allies, restricting the French cavalry and funneling their advance into positions of vulnerability. Mist clung to hedgerows and trees, rendering distance deceptive and hiding the rhythm of impending violence. It was in this gray stillness that history quietly tilted, not with the spectacle of thunderous charges, but with the invisible force of terrain, fatigue, and anticipation. When the first volleys of arrows descended, the field seemed to tremble under invisible weight. French knights, armored and proud, slipped in mud, impaled by shafts before they could react. Horses stumbled, banners toppled, and momentum faltered. The English held steady, not through grandeur, but through timing, positioning, and endurance, exploiting every misstep, every hesitation, every subtle advantage granted by weather and land. What should have been overwhelming force became a liability. As numbers pressed against narrow space, movement hindered by the very earth that supported it. By midday, the scale of destruction revealed itself quietly. Nobles lay fallen, lines fragmented, and command unraveled. Henry's victory was achieved not through spectacle or dramatic heroism, but through patient application of knowledge, observation, and calm resolve. The battlefield, sodden and scarred, offered no grandiose display. It spoke instead in silence, in the subtle collapse of expectation, in the way careful calculation turned apparent weakness into triumph. When the fighting ended, the field was still, bearing the faint scent of gunpowder and damp earth. England had claimed an impossible victory, yet it was not celebrated with pomp. The achievement lived in endurance, strategy, and quiet mastery over circumstance. Agincourt teaches that battles are not always won by sheer force, but by attention to subtlety, by patience, and by the capacity to see opportunity where others see only overwhelming certainty. The square of Cajamarca lay asterisk, shrouded in the fragile light of early morning, a lattice of shadows stretching across stone streets that had seen generations pass unnoticed. November of 1532, and the Ennies held their breath. The city, perched between desert plains and towering peaks, seemed to hum quietly, as if aware of the storm of history poised to descend. Atahualpa, radiant in ceremonial gold, moved among his attendants with an ease born of centuries of inherited authority. His presence radiated calm, yet the morning itself whispered caution. A subtle warning carried on the chill wind weaving between walls and rooftops. Francisco Pizarro and his small force of men arrived not with the clamor of conquest, but with a measured, almost invisible precision. Fewer than 200 Spaniards, armed with steel, muskets, and the newly terrifying power of gunpowder, approached the plaza with the quiet patience of predators who understood their prey would not flee. The contrast was stark. Tens of thousands of unarmed Incas, accustomed to ritual and ceremony, unaware that history would pivot not through strength of arms, but through calculation, audacity, and the sudden unraveling of expectation. The encounter began with gestures and careful negotiation, a fragile dance masking the undercurrent of menace. Then, with a sudden, breathtaking swiftness, the trap closed. Cavalry struck into the stunned mass of nobles and attendants. Muskets roared, their sound alien to the Andes, a rupture that startled and disoriented. Steel met flesh, chains clinked around the emperor's wrists, and in an instant, the unthinkable occurred. Atahualpa, the Sun King, was captured. The vast army, paralyzed in disbelief, offered no resistance sufficient to counter the shock and precision of a force so small. Time itself seemed suspended. A heartbeat stretched into eternity as the plaza absorbed the enormity of the moment. What followed was the slow, deliberate dismantling of an empire's spine. The emperor's captivity transformed into leverage, and gold, collected and hurried, trembling quantities, became both ransom and testament to vulnerability. Yet beyond material loss lay a deeper fracture, the disintegration of certainty, the quiet unmooring of authority that had seemed eternal. Couriers carried messages of confusion. Temples and palaces, once filled with ceremony and song, now echoed with fear and uncertainty. Cajamarca became the pivot upon which the vast reach of the Inca world shifted, its fate sealed not by overwhelming force, but by audacious timing and subtle cunning. When months later Atahualpa was executed, silence fell over the Andes. Mountains, rivers, and plains absorbed it, imprinting the memory of disbelief and loss upon the landscape itself. The empire unraveled gradually. Nobility contested succession, and roads that had carried messages of unity now bore rumors of chaos. Cajamarca, small, sunlit, and suddenly alien, adored as a locus of quiet transformation, a place where history turned on the slender hinge of a moment, where silence itself became the instrument of conquest, and where even the brightest sun could fall into shadow. Yes, the plains near Narva awoke under a fragile gray light, the frost glinting on grass blades like scattered silver, as if the land itself were studded with memories of what was to come. November of 1700, and the air carried a brittle chill that seeped through cloaks and armor, biting skin and bone alike. On one side stood the Swedish army, lean and disciplined, led by Charles XII, a boy king of barely 20 years, whose gaze held both fire and focus beyond his years. Opposite them, the Russian forces under Peter the Great, more numerous and confident, arrayed themselves with pride, their banners snapping against the cold wind. The stage was set for a confrontation that would reverberate quietly through history, a battle where cunning, patience, and the cruel hands of circumstance would shape outcomes far more than the thunder of cannons or the clash of swords. The Swedish troops, though fewer, moved with precision born of relentless training. Their muskets, polished and accurate, promised devastation when aligned with strategy. The Russians, confident in their numbers, prepared to overwhelm through brute strength. Yet the battlefield itself, the icy river, the marshy banks, and the early frost would not bend entirely to human will. Mist curled along the water, concealing movement, and the frozen ground shifted unexpectedly under boots and hooves, turning confidence into vulnerability. Narva was a stage that demanded more than courage. It required understanding of subtle forces beyond mere numbers. When battle commenced, the Swedish lines advanced deliberately, their volleys coordinated with uncanny accuracy. Cannon smoke mingled with fog, distorting perception, turning the mass of enemy soldiers into shifting, indistinct forms. Panic spread quietly through the Russian ranks as musket fire struck with precision, and frozen ground betrayed the weight of cavalry and infantry alike. Pride, momentum, and preparation so certain in theory became liabilities, channeled and exploited by a smaller, disciplined force. By mid-morning, Russian cohesion faltered, commanders struggled to restore order, and retreat became inevitable. Victory was not marked by spectacle, but by the quiet unraveling of expectation. The aftermath left the field eerily still. The frost glinted over the broken banners, the scattered muskets, and the silent forms of those who had fallen. Sweden had achieved the impossible, yet the landscape itself carried the deeper story, a triumph shaped not by overwhelming strength, but by timing, discipline, and the subtle manipulation of circumstance. Narva endures in memory as a place where precision, patience, and understanding of environment triumphed over size and confidence. A haunting reminder that battles are often won in quiet shadows rather than thunderous displays. The island of Malta awoke under the glare of an early summer sun, its cliffs steep and unyielding, its harbors glinting with the restless shimmer of the Mediterranean. May of 1565, and the air was thick with the salt of the sea and the distant, uneasy tension of anticipation. The Knights Hospitaller, bound by oath and faith, moved among their fortifications, inspecting walls, adjusting armor, and whispering prayers to saints whose protection was hoped for, but not guaranteed. Across the waters, the Ottoman Armada loomed, sails filling the horizon with dark promise. Thousands of soldiers ready to test the island's defenses. Yet the true weight of the coming struggle would not be measured in numbers alone, but in patience, endurance, and the unyielding geometry of stone against tide and cannon. The knights, fewer in number than the invaders, relied on careful preparation and intimate knowledge of the terrain. Valleys, cliffs, and narrow passes became allies, their contours shaping strategy and magnifying the strength of those who defended them. The Ottomans, confident in experience and resources, pressed forward with expectation of swift conquest. But the island itself resisted. Water cut movement, walls deflected assault. Each cannonball, each scaled ladder encountered not only human defiance, but centuries of labor embedded in stone and mortar. Malta became a living participant, offering advantage to those who understood its contours and frustrating the pride of those who did not. The siege unfolded over weeks with a tension that refused sudden release. Cannon fire shook walls and stirred dust, yet it was the slow, methodical attrition, the endurance of the defenders, and the subtle intelligence of positioning that dictated the battle's rhythm. Night brought temporary silence, pierced only by distant cries and the faint glimmer of torches along enemy lines. Every dawn renewed both hope and dread, the island holding firm against expectation, stretching the patience of the invaders, and revealing that victory is often determined not in a single dramatic charge, but in the quiet accumulation of small, persistent resistances. When the Ottoman forces finally withdrew, battered by attrition, disease, and the unyielding resolve of the knights, Malta had not merely survived, it had asserted itself as a bulwark, a testament to how fortitude, preparation, and understanding of environment can defy overwhelming odds. The harbor waters returned to their restless shimmer. The cliffs, scorched and pocked, held the memory of countless assaults, and the air carried the lingering whisper that battles, even when invisible to spectacle, shape history through endurance, patience, and a quiet refusal to yield. Malta stands timeless, a silent witness to courage tempered by calculation, and the enduring power of resistance shaped as much by land and mine as by blade and gun. The plains near Breitenfeld stretched beneath a pale autumn sky, the early morning light filtering through clouds that seemed to weigh heavily on the world. September of 1631, and the air trembled with anticipation, carrying the faint scent of dew earth and smoke from distant campfires. Armies gathered on either side of the field. The Protestant forces of Gustavus Adolphus facing the Catholic League's seasoned troops under Count Tilly. Numbers alone did not tell the story. It was in the subtle geometry of ground, formation, and patience where fate would quietly decide the day. The earth itself seemed poised, watching, holding its judgment until the first movement shattered the hush. Gustavus's men, disciplined and nimble, moved with the precise rhythm of training and instinct. Artillery, light and mobile, promised devastation when aligned with terrain, each cannon positioned to exploit both slope and cover. The Catholic forces, larger and confident, relied on tradition, mass pike squares, and the weight of experience, believing that discipline and size could prevail against nimble tactics. Yet the field of Breitenfeld demanded more than confidence. It demanded attention, timing, and subtle orchestration. Mist and early morning haze softened lines, concealed movement, and lent advantage to those who could see beyond the obvious. When battle commenced, it was not sudden or overwhelming. It unfolded like a quiet unraveling of expectation. Cannon and musket fire struck with precision, fragmenting the Catholic formations before cavalry charges could find momentum. The Protestant infantry advanced with unyielding patience, using maneuver, terrain, and firepower to transform numerical disadvantage into advantage. Each action, each pause, each adjustment carried weight. The field itself became a silent participant, amplifying advantages, concealing intent, and revealing the fragility of overconfidence. As the day wore on, Count Tilly's forces faltered, their lines broken less by valor than by careful exploitation of weakness, by patience, and by awareness of subtlety. By mid-afternoon, the Catholic army collapsed, retreating under the careful pursuit of Gustavus's disciplined men. The victory was decisive yet quiet. It did not demand spectacle or fanfare, but it reshaped the trajectory of war across Europe. Breitenfeld endured not as a story of overwhelming might, but as a testament to strategy, observation, and timing. The fields returned to silence, grass bending under wind and rain, carrying the memory of a battle decided by calculation, patience, and the subtle interplay of land and mind. It remains a quiet reminder that victory is often the product of understanding, not mere force, and that history shifts most profoundly in moments unseen, between expectation and realization.